All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our final webinar of this summer series. And my name is Belen. I am the Strategic Engagement Associate here at PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization conducting independent research at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. And today we're going to have a deep dive into charismatic politics. Who are charismatic Christians? How are they shaping American politics and culture today? So I'm going to go ahead and pass things off to the CEO of PRRI, Ms. Melissa Deckman, to get us started.
Thank you, Belen. I want to welcome everyone here today to our final Meet the Moment webinar of the summer. I'm excited to end on this note because I think trying to unpack the influence of charismatic Christianity in American politics today is really important. And we have an all-star team to help us address that very issue. We are waiting on one additional person, so hopefully Leah Payne will be joining us momentarily. But in the meantime, I wanted to actually pass along the baton first to Paul Jupe, then to Dara Delgado. And what I want them to do is introduce themselves and their affiliation. Oh, Leah is here. Great. So we'll start first with Paul, then Dara, then Leah. And what I wanted to do was to have them, when they introduce themselves, really talk about why we should care about studying charismatic Christians from a political perspective, or maybe share with us sort of a great example of why it matters in today's politics when it comes to understanding, the role of the Christian right and charismatic Christianity. So I'm going to hand the baton over to Paul Jupe. So Paul.
Taken, thanks. Yeah, I'm Paul Jupe. I'm a political science professor at Denison University in the Data for Political Research program. And I've been studying religion and politics a long time. Came up with Melissa way back in the day in the 90s. And super happy to be here today to study this. I apologize if you hear puppies barking in the background. I'm on vacation, but happy to be here for this. I think one of the reasons why we should be studying charismatic Christians in modern American politics is that you have heard of the term the Seven Mountain Mandate. And the fact that we have been talking about whether politicians are anointed by God to be in their positions. Those are contributions from the charismatic religious movement, and they've swept through American religion and politics.
Terrific. Dara, why don't you give us your perspective? Tell us who you are and why you think it's important that we're studying charismatic Christianity right now in American politics.
Well, first, Melissa, thank you so much for this invitation and this opportunity to be with my esteemed colleagues to have this discussion, which I think is important. So I'm Dara Delgado. I am currently at UNCW in the beautiful coastal city of Wilmington. I am also a twice over PRRI fellow. And so I am so grateful to be here to talk about the thing that kind of is my bread and butter. Why do I think it's important? Well, if I had to give you a low-hanging fruit kind of quick answer, it would be an affinity for power, right? Proximity to power, financial power, political power. Charismatic Christians in this contemporary moment are enjoying, right, a particular access to power that maybe they haven't seen before. And they share that with this current administration. And so watching these two dance together is quite interesting. So that's the broad answer. Something a little bit more narrow is we are bombarded with images of charismatics operating in this proximity of power through social media, right? So whether it is worship Sundays in the White House, this is new, right? Or watching charismatics stand on the Capitol praying and speaking in tongues and prophesying, laying hands on the president. This is all quite interesting. And this is in contrast to what we see when someone like a Reverend Barber gets arrested for praying out loud for the looming threat of what will happen with the budget cuts back in May, right? So there's this access to power. There's this way in which they're able to nuzzle up very closely to the systems that are moving the needle in this country. But I want to actually look, I'm actually much more curious at looking at not just kind of these broad social media, these kind of like clickbait things, but the ways in which it's much more subtle. If we would think about something like, I don't know, the Department of Homeland Security and the ways in which they're using biblical passages to embolden right? And to empower a certain demographic of not only voters, but Christians, namely charismatic Christians. They're speaking the idiom of not only violence, but also spiritual warfare that charismatics understand in particular. And so when we're thinking about immigration, when we're thinking about the role of ICE, when we're thinking about a militarized state and the country, the arm of the country, the governmental arm of the country, is using language that is particular to a demographic of folks who understand the nature of warfare and power, whether it's real or imagined. We need to be paying attention to what's going on in that discourse.
Thank you, Dara. Boy, lots already to talk about here, and we haven't even gotten to Leah Payne, so I'm going to toss it over to Leah. So please introduce yourself, Leah, and maybe share a thought or two about why you think it's important to understand charismatic Christianity today.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, I'm delighted to be here with some of my favorite thinkers on this topic, by the way. So the pleasure is definitely mine to be here. I'm Leah Payne. I'm associate professor, or professor of American Religious History at Portland Seminary in Portland, Oregon. That's a new one. Thank you. And I'm also delighted to be affiliated with PRRI because, in part because I am also a former public fellow, and I was able to, PRRI gave me and several other colleagues a really long leash in terms of exploring charismatic Christianity in the United States. And so I'm so excited to be with the crew that inspired that research and supported it along the way. I think it's important to study charismatic Christians from a political perspective, in large part because when we think of the growing edge of quote unquote evangelical Christianity in the United States and also transnationally, we are talking about charismatic Christians in almost every case. So if you look at the growth of non-denominational Christianity, for example, especially in what we might otherwise identify as evangelicalism, and you look at their practices, you see that those folks are functionally charismatic. So if we want to understand evangelicalism and its future, we need to look to the charismatics, who are on average younger, much more racially diverse, and they have a different understanding of the body politic than the types of people that we would have understood as evangelical in other generations. So just one example would be this conception of democracy as a theological good that you get from what I would think of as a Baptist dominant strain of evangelicalism. So when we think of the Billy Graham coalition of evangelicalism, the charismatics do not have that same theological value for democracy. And so if we want to understand how charismatics or if we want to understand the future of evangelicalism, we need to understand charismatics and things like the Seven Mountains Mandate and the NAR are, I think, proof of the ascent of charismatics. The fact that they're having such influence on the right tells us not necessarily that there's something inherently right-wing about charismatic theology and ideology. Dr. Delgado and I have written a little bit about how charismatic ideas come out through Black charismatics, for example. So it doesn't necessarily need to lead to conservatism. I think what it means is they're ascendant everywhere. And so if we want to understand evangelical Christianity, we have to understand the charismatics.
Oh, that was a great way to start. So many questions, so much discussion to be had here. What I'd like to do now actually is just to go over some brief facts about American religion, kind of the religious landscape very briefly, but then take a little bit of a deeper dive into a survey that we released last year, where we actually asked American churchgoers about their practices in terms of charismatic Christianity, and also some of the beliefs that are linked to, in fact, a charismatic Christianity. So first off, and I should say to the audience, I failed to mention this at the beginning, please submit your questions to our Q&A box. We're going to try to get to them by the end of the day, but we find that this conversation often goes pretty quickly, but we'll try our best. All right, so I thought I would just start with sort of the overall religious landscape, and this is data from our most recent PRRI Census of American Religion. In fact, if you're so interested and so inclined, please go to our website. You can read the full report there. Lots of things to play around with, but this in a nutshell shows you how Americans kind of consider themselves in terms of religious affiliation. So 28% of Americans, that big purpley pink slice of the pie, are Americans who are religiously unaffiliated. Then we move to the second part of the chart here. The colors in blue are the categories that are who we classify as white Christians, from evangelical Protestants to more mainline non-evangelical to white Catholics, and then some representation among Latter-day Saints and Orthodox Christians. So essentially, that's about 40% of the American public right now. So 4 in 10 Americans are white and Christian. The green slices of the pie represent Christians of color, from Hispanic Protestants to Catholics to other Catholics of color. So that again shows you sort of the approximation. About 25% of the US population are Christians of color. And then the orange slices of the pie are a lot smaller because they denote Americans who subscribe to some sort of a kind of minority faith in terms of their representation of the US population, from American Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and Unitarians, for example. But I wanted to take just a deeper dive in terms of a little bit of trend data. And so we've been collecting data in our Census of American Religion since 2013. And this shows you over time 3 of those largest groups that we just saw on the pie chart. So if you look at the top blue line, this is the percentage of white Christians in America. We had about 46% in 2013, according to our census. It's now down to 40%. And that's been a gradual decrease of the number of white Christians, due in part to growth of those Americans becoming religiously unaffiliated, but also because we're becoming a more diverse nation in terms of race and ethnicity. At the same time, you'll see that the purple line shows an increase in the number of Americans who are religiously affiliated. There's been a lot of talk recently that maybe there's been a little bit of a plateauing in terms of the number of religiously affiliated. That might be true, but I suspect that it's probably going to increase for a number of reasons, which will be maybe the topic of our next webinar. Anyway, but if you look at the other line here, these are Christians of color, and there's been remarkable, I think, similarity in terms of stability, rather, in terms of the number and the percentage of Christians of color. It was about 1 in 5 in 2013, and it's still basically 1 in 5 Americans today. So we decided in our religious change survey, which was released last spring, the data were collected in late 2023. We wanted to get a sense of, among Americans who attend church regularly, right? So this is not all Americans, but those who are going to church on a regular basis, how much experience they have with charismatic events within their worship experience or their worship attendance here. And we decided to pick 5 categories. And I should shout out to Leah and her pod, who were part of the PRRI Fellows program. They did some really important work on this, and we kind of rode, the coattails of their work here, and we adopted those questions for our larger national survey here. And so we ask Americans, a variety of behaviors have they experienced if they're going to church, from people speaking in tongues, which is kind of what you tend to think about when you think about, I think about charismatic Christians, how they're distinct from other, Americans, other Christians. We find that 21% of Americans say that they have experienced or witnessed, at least while attending a service, people speaking in tongues. So it's not a lot of churchgoers. At the same time, if you go to the other end of the spectrum, we see that about half of American churchgoers say they've had a definitive answer to a specific prayer. And then there's a range in terms of divine healing. They've experienced or witnessed that in a church service. They've had a direct revelation from God, or the Spirit has empowered them or someone else to do a specific task. And so what's interesting here, 2 takeaways. When it comes to the definitive answer to specific prayer, for me, it's notable that Republicans, churchgoers, are more likely to say that that's something that they've experienced or witnessed. But it's not unheard of among independents and Democrats either. But in general, some of the more, I think, emotive sorts of behaviors, like speaking in tongues or witnessing, faith healing, tends to happen more among Democrats than Republicans. But that is in part, I think, if you look at the next graph, you're seeing some explanation for that. The one group, or I'm sorry, go back to the bottom part of that chart. Sorry, Belen. The one group that really stands apart, and I think Dara is going to maybe help us walk through some of this, is that African Americans, churchgoers, tend to have far more experience with these charismatic events than white Americans, and even, Hispanic and other race Americans. And I think that's something we're going to kind of touch base with on in a little bit in our conversation. So the next slide, please. What we did was essentially, so most people might recognize, or many Americans who go to church might say there might be kind of answered prayers that have happened. But that alone is not enough to, I think, characterize someone as being a charismatic or at least having a lot of experiences. So we decided to look at Americans who've had 3 or more of those experiences in a religious service. And about 31% then of those Americans we classify as being charismatic or having experience with charismatic Christianity. And here again, there's no difference among Republicans and Democrats, which I think is pretty notable. And Black Protestants stand out really as a unique kind of characteristic here because they're having those experiences in their worship services far more often than white Americans. You don't see it as much nearly among Catholics or among white mainline non-evangelical Protestants, for example. And the last slide really looks at attitudes in terms of views on prophets and prophecy, which is also, I think, linked to charismatic Christianity. This is looking at all Americans, not just churchgoers. And so we had 2 questions on the survey. One is sort of this kind of green dot says, do you agree that God reveals his plans for the future to humans as prophecy? We see more agreement with that among Americans writ large, like 45%, which is pretty high, I think, compared with agreeing that modern day prophets continue to reveal God's plans to humanity, which I think we haven't really seen Americans agreeing with that nearly as much. Here, the table that is pretty interesting, the Latter-day Saints really jump out as being very unique to everybody else on this measure. But again, what's notable to me is looking at 3 and 4 Black Protestants, white evangelicals, Hispanic Protestants, basically agreeing that God reveals his plans, which is kind of an interesting aspect of, I think, charismatic theology. All right, so with that, I want to turn to our guests once again to get their thoughts on what we've just seen, but also just having a couple of larger questions I'm going to be posing to them. So what I'd like to ask first, and I'm going to start with Leah here. So what is the distinctiveness of charismatic Christianity as it relates to the broader evangelical movement? So maybe you could walk us through what makes charismatics unique within a subculture of evangelical Christianity.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think because I'm a historian, I feel like I need to start at the very beginning with charismatic practices. And at least in the United States, in the early 20th century, there was a very influential series of revivals. The most influential one was in Los Angeles, California, called the Azusa Street Revival. And a bunch of American revivalists participated in that. And from that revival came a bunch of new religious movements, new denominations known as Pentecostalism. And that was associated with the practice, specifically associated with practices like speaking in tongues and divine healing. And those were distinct denominations. Decades later, those practices started to overflow into other forms of American Christianity. And from that, the people who practiced those practices outside of those formal denominations were known as charismatics. And so it's not really a denomination or an identity that people would necessarily take up as, I used to be Southern Baptist, but now I'm a charismatic, although it could be. But it's sort of like an add-on to their other form of identity. So when we think about charismatic Christianity, I see it as a series of practices that are very popular and really growing in evangelicalism. But they can be much broader than evangelical Christianity. It can be way outside of Protestantism. For example, I saw someone in the comments saying that a Catholic sister who's been involved in charismatic events, and that makes total sense. The charismatic movement was very influential in the 20th century in Catholicism. So I see it is a series of practices. I think that's the best way to look at it, not necessarily a label or a brand as such.
Terrific. Dara, I wanted to kind of turn it to you before we let Paul be the last responder to this question, but I wanted you to maybe touch more on sort of the racial ethnic differences within charismatic Christianity, because I'm really blown away by that one chart we saw where there's a very distinct group here when it comes to those kinds of practices. So maybe talk a little bit about sort of racial ethnic differences among charismatics and maybe even what it means to politics.
Yeah. So typically in public spaces where Leah Payne and I are together in a conference and someone brings up the charismatic question, I defer to her, probably to to a fault because I tend to lean in more heavily on maybe this kind of traditional or classical Pentecostal conversation, right? Like, what does it mean to be Pentecostal? What is the social historical framework around that? But because of the political moment, I've had to actually reassess my relationship with this conversation. So I'm really grateful for this question. And where I've landed over the last, I want to say, year is that in order to understand what is happening, I think with among Black American Christians is to maybe frame it as an intra-racial, generational, and class divide. So just bear with me for a second. I'll be quick, but just bear with me. And I think that this can help inform our understanding of charismatic Christianity among Black Americans, especially. So, like their counterparts, mainline Black Christians who are Baptists and Methodists do that additive thing, right? But they've always been emotive, right? My grandmother was a devout Methodist before converting to Pentecostalism. And my mother still tells stories of being with her at Salem Methodist Church in New York City, and my grandmother lifting her hands and crying in this very austere Black church. So there's always been this emotive element and this freedom in the worship, but there's also been this sense historically, particularly of older generations of mainline Black Christians, where they wanted to reject or separate themselves from some of that emotive expression as vestiges of slave religion. So all of that embodied practice looked a little too primitive, right? If we're going to be part of respectability politics, we need to be much more reserved. We need to be much more demure in our worship. We need to be much more sophisticated in how we engage with spirit and the word and worship and all these other things. Okay. So there's that one line, that generation of like, if we're going to have access to certain levels of mainstream society, we cannot be caught, right, conducting ourselves like some of our ancestors practiced their worship. But I think that when we're having this conversation around it in our contemporary world, we need to remember that the charismatic movement came to us on the heels of the civil rights movement. There's something that we need to wrestle with in this conversation. So when we hear charismatic movement, oftentimes the thing that comes into our mind are probably white Christians who are doing the additive thing. But in Black spaces where folks are deciding to return to this more primitive style of worship, they're doing it on the heels of the civil rights movement. They're doing it on the heels of the myth of a post-racial society. Many of them are going to good schools. They're getting good jobs. They're sending their kids to good programs to help them be good American citizens. And so in many ways, they're having to choose to be maybe Christian before Black or be American before Black. And so when they take on this kind of charismatic identity, it's a way of them becoming much more Americana, much more mainstream. And so they might be doing it in predominantly Black spaces, or they might be going to those interracial megachurches, right? As a sign that I am participating in a much more gentrified version of activity of the spirit, but I'm still kind of hanging on to that past. Okay, so what does this mean to us? Okay, why should we pay attention? I think that when we take into account the generation that made the decision to maybe still practice more demonstrative forms of Christianity through the charismatic movement, and they found themselves in different socioeconomic brackets that also affected them politically. They began to be in circles where maybe they embraced the idea of bootstrapping. Maybe they accepted the conversation about Black on Black crime. Maybe they did believe that if you work hard enough, you can attain something without taking into consideration the role of systemic racism. And if we're going to be honest about charismatic Christianity, and they're sitting in churches where they're hearing this, now we have to take into consideration what that means in terms of their politics and their voting practices. So there's a coming of age moment where now we're looking at the result of that generation that maybe moved into a conservative stream, borrowed a particular type of gentrified charismatic Christianity, and now they're having to reconsider a lot of things, right? So why does this matter now? Yes, they're speaking in tongues. Yes, they're believing in prophecy. Yes, they're doing healing, but many of them are now having to reconsider, how does this affect my Black identity, not just my American one? And so that's something that I'm looking at now. What is this generation going to do to blend the two ideas of maintaining their expressive modes of religiosity, but also recognizing that a particular conservative politics that they found in their religious spaces maybe growing up no longer fit?
Thank you, Dara. I want to turn to Paul for the last word here. We had a brief conversation before we jumped on, and we were talking really about how the Christian right as a concept has really changed, and sort of the players active in the Christian right has changed. And there's, I think, implications when it comes to charismatic Christianity. So, Paul, could you maybe speak a little bit about how, in thinking about charismatic Christianity and traditional evangelicalism, what's changed and what should we be looking at in this political moment? What's important to you? What jumps out to you?
Everything's changed. I'm thinking about when I grew up politically in the 1980s. Yes, that was a very long time ago. And 1988 stands out the most to me, in part because Pat Robertson, who was a televangelist at the time, associated with Pentecostalism, but clearly sort of Pentecostal charismatic, are linked in some ways. But anyway, so he was running for the Republican nomination for president. And the question came up, would other conservative Christians endorse him? And there was a deep divide within evangelicalism, such that someone like Jerry Falwell would refuse to endorse Pat Robertson, in part and mostly because they believed that Pentecostals were essentially demonic. To believe that the Spirit would infuse people, that you could see prophecy beyond the bounds of the Bible, was heresy, was devil worship. We've come a long ways, in part, then I sort of dismissed Pentecostalism and charismatic faith because of the scandals around televangelists in the 80s and 90s, but they've come roaring back. And of course, as Leah pointed out, they're the fastest growing religious group probably in the world today, and I think in the United States. So what's come full circle, especially because of the platforming of Donald Trump provided to charismatic faith leaders, that I think evangelicalism is in progress of being captured by charismatic kind of ideas. I think maybe not practices, but certainly the ideas and prophetic memes that are being shared by charismatic leaders. So these days, to understand conservative Christian conservatives is to really have to wrestle with what it means to be charismatic and what the worldview of a charismatic looks like. And I think we're going to get into that in a few minutes.
Yeah, that's a nice segue, actually, Paul. I want to kind of furrow into a specific sort of even subfield within charismatic Christianity, and that's really New Apostolic Reformation. And Leah had mentioned that briefly. I wanted to have Paul start on this part of our conversation because I know he's done some really interesting and I think even path-breaking work on the 7 mountain mandates and how it's linked to our politics. So, Paul, I'm just going to turn it to you and maybe just give our audience a brief kind of overview of what New Apostolic Reformation is, and it's linked maybe also to Christian nationalism and what's happening now in politics.
Yeah, happy to, and that's great. So the New Apostolic Reformation is this sort of movement. I think it's best characterized as a network of leaders that kind of share a religious worldview as well as a set of kind of societal world level goals of dominion. And what's kind of interesting about them is that even though we have a label that we use to identify them, and they used it really early on in its development, they wouldn't use that in public today. So they don't refer to themselves as having any particular label. They haven't set up any particular organizational structure, so they're not a denomination. And instead, they're this, like I said, this network of leaders that share ways to reach out to more of the faithful, and they're incredibly flexible in terms of the particulars of the faith and how they would reach out to people. And so whoever comes up with the next sort of prophetic meme, others are going to adopt that if it seems like it resonates with people, and they're going to propagate that into the future. And one of the ones that's reached kind of our level and reached my level, you might dismiss this as social media, kind of, just social media posts, but I think that's the way that a lot of people are reached, and that's the way that I was reached, in the sense that I became aware of it. And my MO has been, if I hear something that seems interesting and to my ear a little bit strange, I wonder how many other people believe that, and so then I throw it on a survey and find out that a lot of people believe it. And that's true for the 7 mountain mandate. which is the sense that God is calling people to ascend the seven mountains of society and culture and government, education and business, and it essentially means that God wants you to attain dominion over the different aspects of world culture and life. But lots of other things have come up this way, and the NAR, as we call it, has been, I think, at the forefront because they really have these strong dominion goals and are incredibly motivated to get involved with politics. And of course, have been platformed by Donald Trump. So we're aware of all kinds of new leaders because of that. The gateway person was Paula White, but now we know about Lance Wallnau and Julie Green and all kinds of other folks. And I've probably said too much, so I'll let my colleagues jump in and say some more.
That was a terrific overview, actually, Paul. Dara, do you want to maybe chime in here, and then we'll close with Leah on New Apostolic Reformation, maybe some of your thoughts.
Yeah, this is also interesting. So when we look at what you showed, right, we have 7 in 10 Black Americans identifying as Christian, right? 66% of them roughly having some kind of charismatic experience, which includes prophecy, right? Believing that the word of God will be not only delivered through a source, but also will manifest itself in real time and in their lifetime, preferably. But we also have other studies that have shown similar numbers where Black Americans really do believe in the scriptures and the Bible as this kind of guiding light for their lives, right? So again, around 70%. So what does this mean when someone holds a microphone and makes a declaration that sounds like King James Version of the Bible and they latch on to it? Well, I loved what Paul brought to our attention, because if you notice, if I can play this a little bit here, the key players that he's named are melanin deficient. This conversation around dominance and dominate, this doesn't mean that you don't see Black and Hispanic identified persons a part of these communities, because I can name some. But when we're talking about the thrust and again, that idiom of violence and that idiom of domination, and not just stewardship, but like owning and taking over, we're returning to a language around colonization and capturing. And now when we're thinking about Black charismatics, how much are they going to play with that language? How much rope do they have to move in that space, considering their marginalized and oppressed histories? And so looking at NAR and how it shows up in spaces that are historically marginalized, and thinking about how both communities are using scripture, how both communities are using prayer, how both communities are using songs about the kingdom, we now have to interrogate much more closely how folks could be singing the same songs of Zion and coming out with two different outcomes, right? And so I love this conversation because I'm always curious about who's in and who's out, who are the main players and who aren't, and if we are mindful of what we were really saying in terms of its historical significance, right? So we're looking forward, but we have some history around when Western folks decided that they wanted to dominate land and take over something. So it's always an exciting conversation for me to think about it from these perspectives.
Thank you, Dara. And Leah, have you had the last word when it comes to the New Apostolic Reformation? Maybe some of your thoughts here.
Sure. Wow, that's an honor here. I would say when I think about the New Apostolic Reformation, I think about it as a kind of Pentecostalized or charismaticized version of the moral majority or the Christian coalition, in the sense that it's a white dominant form of activism that is very media oriented. It's more diverse than I think previous forms of right-wing Christianity in the United States, because the charismatic movement is more diverse overall than other forms of conservative Protestantism in the US. And I think to Dr. Jupe's point about the fact that it is really media centric, and that can make us, maybe tempt us to dismiss it a little bit. I think it skilled and to think should bring that, it should reorient us toward paying attention toward those movements. It is living on social media, but it's living among a people who know how to use that as activism very well and have a long history of doing that. And to Dr. Delgado's point about, I think this makes me think of, there's a really good book. I'm going to give a shout out to my colleague, John Maiden, a book called Age of the Spirit that explores in the Anglophone world, the rise of a transnational charismatic movement. And he identifies what he calls like a cosmopolitan class of people who can afford to go all over the world, who can travel to these revival meetings, because this is a lot of these folks, these activists, they have the means to participate in this world. So we're talking about a particular subsection of charismatics as well, people who can do this. And I think, Paula White-Cain was no surprise the popularizer of this in the Trump administration. If you just visually look at her, she's someone who belongs in the Trump administration. She's got a lot of affinities with the president. So I think we definitely ought to be paying attention to this group as a sort of next gen version. Not the only one, because if there's one thing to keep in your mind about charismatics is that they are no respecter of institutional boundaries. So the minute the title of NAR or NAR, whatever we're calling it, is inconvenient for them, they'll pick up another title. We need to be paying attention to them because they are the form of right-wing activism that has the most energy and the most proximity to the president.
Great. That's a great point to end on. We're going to switch gears here a little bit and kind of close our conversation about what's next. What do we need to be studying when it comes to this very influential movement in American politics at the moment? One of the things that struck me, Paul, in your conversation and talking about the history of, the troubled history initially between, like the Falwells and the more kind of establishment Christian right, which I think in the 80s and 90s still was wedded to some form of a democracy. I think it's easy to be in favor of a democracy when you're in the majority. That kind of is convenient. Whereas I think now, when we think about dominionism and sort of the elements of some of the more troubling aspects I would find from this kind of faith tradition, I'm wondering to what extent that's taken over entirely in terms of the Christian right, or what we want to call it, the role of social media in all of this, because that's come up a lot. We have such a fractured landscape right now in terms of the media, and people are getting, I think, very thin theology from tweets or from, Truth Social posts. And so how that's all shaping our ideas about charismatic Christianity, its relationship to politics and power, I think are really worth kind of considering in the future. So that's my particular take on it. But I want to go to Dara to ask her what she thinks is missing in our conversation. What do we need to be studying in the future when it comes to charismatic Christianity?
So my 12-year-old says I only talk about three things, and that is Black people, women, and Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. So that, right? that is what's missing in this conversation, in my opinion. And I nodded to this earlier when I said that we need to interrogate what we imagine, right, in our cultural discourse around charismatics. And in all seriousness, I really would like us to think about those numbers that we saw. If 7 in 10 Black Americans who identify as religious identify as Christian, and the average age is about 49. And in that population, we're looking at about 60% of that group being women, Black women in particular. We need to start paying attention to what that means, because if they're Christian, and they're claiming to have at least 60% of them are at least claiming to have had some experience with charismatic experience. And they're making up the majority of the church. And they're also making up a large segment of the Democratic voting bloc. These are things that we don't want to treat as separate parts, but we want to put them in a complex Venn diagram and see what's happening in the moment. And for me, I'm most curious about those who make up the so-called 92%, where they go to church, what they're saying in terms of their religious rhetoric, how they are maybe prophesying to the moment or not. I am curious about the Black women religious who still hold on to some of these charismatic ideas, but are also very much politically astute. And right now they are blatantly quiet. And they said this, right? They said as much, right? They are deliberately being silent, and they are applauding their candidate of choice for also making a decision to now work outside of the system to do something a little bit more grassroots. I don't know if anybody caught that interview that the former vice president did a few days ago. And I mean, they're actively applauding her for joining them and working differently. This actually makes a lot of sense, though. And I've written about this, so allow me to plug myself, where the claim is that oftentimes Pentecostals, particularly Black Pentecostals, were not necessarily involved in political activity. But more often than not, that's not true. They just did it outside of the system. They made change, they made waves outside of the system. So we're actually seeing kind of a return, right? Where folks are regrouping, they're doing more grassroots effort, they're trying to figure out what is important to their community, and they're doing it from the outside. And they are using the language of charismatic Christianity. They are decreeing that God will have the final say. They are using scripture to make their claim. They are practicing some form of spiritual warfare. But again, it looks very, very different than maybe their counterparts. And so for me, the question is, who do we mean by charismatic? We need to be paying attention to Black women who might identify with this community and see where that shows up for us, not only in terms of the past election, but in the midterms that's coming.
Thank you, Dara. You know, anytime you bring up gender, my ears perk up because I think there's a gendered analysis that we could have a whole nother webinar on this topic. So thank you for mentioning that. Leah, and then Paul, let Paul have the last word. But Leah, what do you think we need to be studying? What do we need to be looking at in this political moment with respect to charismatics?
Well, the short answer I think is everything. I'm really just thrilled that PRRI allowed us, a little group of us, and it's continuing. This research is continuing to start asking more practice-oriented questions, because I think the institutionally driven questions miss a lot from about the charismatic movement and about how ideas that have been percolating in charismatic communities work themselves out over time. I saw in the chart in the chat, Dr. Milner was talking about the denominational structure, and you're totally right, Dr. Milner, that dominionism existed far beyond in charismatic circles, far beyond the rise of the new Apostolic Reformation. And if we think in terms of institutions, then we're going to miss how charismatic communities operate over time. So I would like to continue to just ask those practice-oriented questions. One question that doesn't get asked enough, and I've learned through working with PRRI as a historian, an untrained historian, I've learned that it actually costs money to ask certain questions, and it costs extra money to get non-white respondents. That was something that I didn't know that I learned through working at PRRI. And so I think we need better funded research into especially non-white Protestant and beyond non-white Christianity in the United States, and we'll find out more about the charismatic movement. And I'd also like to ask about Zionism. This is a very core part of charismatic Christianity. I think it transcends most racial and ethnic and class-oriented boundaries in the charismatic movement. And so I would like to ask a lot about that, because that tells us something about, you know, the theology of the end, but for charismatics and Pentecostals, but it also tells us a lot about the conception of the United States and the place of charismatics within it and their responsibility to the nation. If we think of them as not having the same orientation toward democracy, what orientation do they have toward the nation? I think that we'd learn a lot if we asked more about Israel and Zionism.
It's a great place to end for you. And then I'm going to turn it to Paul, who's going to close us out here on what we need to be asking in the future.
So many things. Let me just give an amen to Leia's call for better funded social science. I think that would be fantastic. Unlikely, I think, in the near future, but we really need to be paying more attention to this, because we've basically completely missed the rise of charismatics up until they were staring us in the face and giving us a new language to think about politics. So I'm going to push in a slightly different direction. I'm a little bit less interested in categorizing who a charismatic is, and more interested in thinking about charismatic influence. And that's about the spread of ideas. And I think that Christians, and not just white Christians, absolutely not, but Christians of all racial and ethnic backgrounds are being captured in some ways by a charismatic way of thinking about the world. And that's also a way to connect with the Republican Party. And I've seen that in a variety of different research that using sort of charismatic worldview is a way to think more positively about people like Donald Trump, who are being directly connected to, charismatic kind of dominion level things. But some of the questions that I've been asking that I think are important um, that we should be, thinking about more broadly are really sort of shocking to see the percent of Christians that believe these things. And I don't have your pretty chart to show you or control over the screen, but things like the church should organize campaigns of spiritual warfare and prayer to displace high-level demons is believed in at least my survey by 50% of Christians. 54% of Christians believe that there are demonic principalities and powers who control physical territory. At least in my survey, I had 37% who identified as either charismatic, Pentecostal, or spirit-filled, which pretty loosey-goosey here. But what that says is that there's a much wider distribution of these sorts of beliefs beyond just kind of the narrowish subculture of those who could be categorized as charismatics. So kind of the new sort of apocalyptic kind of worldview that I think characterizes accurately the Republican Party these days, that everything is zero sum, that any gains by Democrats are going to be the loss to not just Republicans, but to Christians, that we are in a battle, and that those on the other side are demon driven. I think that's largely a language vehicle provided by charismatics. And so in order to understand current American religion and especially politics, we need to really wrestle with charismatic influence.
Oh, thank you all. I can't believe we actually run over a little bit on time. This was a wonderful conversation. I feel like we've just started to scratch the surface of learning more about this very influential movement in American politics. I would encourage everyone listening today to follow all three of these scholars who are doing really, really terrific and fantastic work. Paul also has a nice blog, a Religion and Public blog. You can kind of see his latest research, a lot of it which is situated around the new Apostolic Reformation and other sorts of findings. You can kind of find that. Of course, you can go to our own website at PRRI. We have many spotlight analyses that look at charismatic Christianity. Please follow, again, our other guests on social media, but also follow us. If you're not on Instagram or Blue Sky or Threads, we're at PRI Poll. And a final plea here, because both Paul and Leah mentioned it, this is not free research. And so we do need more resources to do this kind of wonderful, groundbreaking, important research. So please consider donating to PRI if you can. Go to our website and you'll see a nice donate button on the right. We're always looking for more support because we believe the work is really, really important. And in this moment, I think this very threatened moment in terms of our democracy, understanding all these elements is really, really critical. But thank you all for coming. Thanks to our guests for a really enlightening conversation. Thank you. Bye.